Good evening and welcome to the Standing Resolution, the only show on television where the best argument wins and nobody gets to pick their favorite side. Tonight we are asking one of the oldest questions human beings have ever put to each other. Not a political question, not a technical one, a question about how a life ought to be lived and how it ought to end. The kind of question that soldiers have answered one way and grandparents another, and poets have been arguing about somewhere in the middle for roughly 3,000 years. Tonight's resolution, stated plainly, is this: it is better to die a glorious death than to live a long, quiet life. Now one of our debaters will argue in favor of that claim, that glory, meaning a death of consequence, of sacrifice, of remembered significance, represents the higher human achievement. The other will argue against it, that a long, quiet life carries its own profound worth, and that the romance of the glorious death deserves a much harder look than it usually gets. Here is the part I always enjoy telling a new audience: neither debater chose their position tonight. Each was assigned their side by random draw. So what you are?
Let me tell you how a ship works, because it has everything to do with this question. When a man signs the articles and steps aboard, he knows the score. The sea doesn't promise him a long life. It promises him a real one. Every hand on that deck has made a choice, a conscious, eyes-open choice, to trade the safe misery of the dockside tavern for something that actually means something. And I have never, in all my years at sea, met a man who signed those articles and later said he wished he'd stayed ashore counting his pennies until he died in a bed. Now here is what I know about glory, and I want to be precise about the word, because people get sentimental and muddy with it. Glory isn't about statues or songs, though sometimes those follow. Glory is about consequence. It is about a death that mattered, a death that happened because you stood for something, fought for something, threw yourself into the world hard enough that the world had to notice. A captain who dies defending his crew, a man who goes down with the colors flying, that death means something. It closes a life that meant something. A long, quiet life now. I'm not sneering at comfort, but ask yourself honestly.
I will not insult the captain's courage. A man who sails into a storm with his eyes open has my respect. But respect is not agreement, and tonight I must say plainly what I have learned in 40 years of raiding, burying friends, and watching young men die for songs that were never sung. The glorious death is not the point. The life is the point. When my father lay old in his hall, furs piled on his chest, grandchildren pulling at his beard, he told me something I did not understand until I was old enough to lose men I loved. He said the bravest thing he ever did was come home. He had stood in the shield wall. He had taken silver and given it freely. And then he had lived. He had planted. He had taught. He had sat long enough by the fire to become the kind of man whose counsel younger men actually needed. The captain speaks of consequence. Good. Then let us count the consequences honestly. The man who dies young and glorious leaves a widow, leaves children who grow up without a hand to guide them, leaves a gap in the world that no saga fills. The song is for the living. The wound is real. I have known warriors who sought the glorious end, because they feared the harder work of E.
Both of our debaters just made a case for how a life ought to close, and I have to say, neither of them made it easy on the other. Coming up next, the rebuttals, where the captain gets to answer the man who says coming home was the bravest act of all, and the Jarl gets to answer for every quiet life that simply faded out. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. I'm Justice Vale, and this is the Standing Resolution. Tonight we're asking whether it is better to die a glorious death than to live a long, quiet life. Our debaters have made their opening cases, and now it's time for them to answer each other. Let's get into the rebuttals.
The Jarl tells me his father was brave because he came home. And I believe him. I do. A man who survives the shield wall and builds a hall and bounces grandchildren on his knee, that is no small thing, and I would not take it from him. But notice what the Jarl is actually describing. A man who fought, who stood in the line, who risked everything and earned the right to come home. That father's quiet old age was purchased with fire. It was the interest on a debt of courage, not the whole account. Strip away the battles, and you have a different man entirely and a different story. The Jarl says the glorious death leaves widows and orphans. True enough. I have seen it. But the long, quiet life leaves something too, and we don't talk about it as much. It leaves men who never found out what they were made of. Men who played it safe until the playing was done and died wondering. That is its own kind of wound, and it doesn't get a saga because nobody writes sagas about regret. He says some men seek glory because they fear the hard work of endurance. Perhaps. But some men seek the quiet life because they fear the hard work of courage. Fear cuts both ways, Jarl. The question isn't W.
The captain is clever, I will grant him that. He says my father's long life was purchased with fire, that the quiet years were interest on a debt of courage. Fine. Then what does that prove? It proves the life was worth living. It proves the man who came home was right to come home. The captain has just argued my case for me and dressed it in his own colors. And this business about men who never found out what they were made of, I have stood over enough graves to tell you what men are made of. Bone and breath and gone. What endures is not the moment of dying, however bright it burned. What endures is what a man built while he still had hands to build with. The captain asks whether you ever truly sailed. I ask whether you ever truly arrived. Because sailing for its own sake, sailing toward a death you have romanticized since boyhood, that is not courage. That is appetite dressed in a hero's cloak. And yes, fear cuts both ways. The captain is right about that much. But there is a third fear we have not named yet, the one that matters most. The fear of a life that asks you to stay, to endure, to become something slowly rather than blaze quickly. That is the fear most men never fack.
Captain, you've argued that glory means a death of consequence, a death the world had to notice. But consequence for whom, exactly? The man who dies defending his crew may be remembered, yes. But the crew he died for will grieve him, raise families without him, carry that loss for decades. If the measure of a good death is its effect on the living, how does leaving that kind of wound count as the better outcome?
That is a fair wound to press on, and I won't dodge it. The grief is real. I have watched men weep over a shipmate, and I have been the one they wept over, near enough. But here is what I know. The crew that loses a captain who died standing for them does not spend the rest of their lives wishing he had slipped away quietly at a safe distance. They carry him differently than that. They carry him with pride. There is grief, yes, and there is also something that holds them together and makes them better sailors for having known him. The wound a glorious death leaves is the kind a man can live inside of and grow. The wound a wasted life leaves, the slow vanishing of someone who never really showed up, that one just hollows people out. One wound teaches, the other only empties. That is the difference.
Jarl, you've made endurance the hero of your argument, the slow building, the long trial, the life that leaves something standing. But endurance in service of what, exactly? A man can endure quietly for decades and leave behind nothing more than a tidy house and a faded name. At what point does a long, quiet life stop being a completed voyage and start being exactly the slow shipwreck the captain described?
That is the sharpest question of the night, and it deserves a straight answer. You are right. Endurance alone proves nothing. A man can outlast everyone he knows and still leave nothing behind worth keeping. Length without purpose is not what I am arguing for. I never said quiet. I said completed. The difference is this. A life of consequence does not require a spectacular death to prove it mattered. It requires that while you lived, you gave something. Counsel, children raised well, a craft passed on, a truth spoken when it cost you something to speak it. These are not tidy houses and faded names. These are the roots that hold the soil long after the tree falls. The question is not whether you burned bright at the end. The question is whether you were genuinely present for the decades before it. A fire that lasts the whole winter warms more than one that blinds you for a single glorious moment.
The captain just told us grief can be a gift, and the Jarl just admitted that a quiet life can absolutely be a shipwreck. So where does that leave us? Next up is the round that separates the great debaters from the merely good, the steelman, where each of these men has to make the strongest possible case for the side they've been fighting against all night. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Standing Resolution. I'm Justice Vale, and tonight we've been asking whether it is better to die a glorious death than to live a long, quiet life. We've just watched both sides take a hit and hold their ground. Now comes the Steelman round, where each man argues the other's case as well as it can possibly be argued.
Here is the strongest thing the Jarl could say, and I want to say it as well as he could. A glorious death is a story told by the living about the dead. The man in the ground has no say in how the tale gets shaped. What we call glory is often just the living making meaning out of a loss they cannot otherwise bear. And the real work of a human life, the unglamorous, grinding, daily work of being present, of teaching someone younger than you, of sitting with grief long enough to come out the other side of it, that work requires you to stay. You cannot do it from a grave. The men who endure, who keep showing up decade after decade, who become genuinely wise rather than permanently young and frozen in a final bright moment, those men give the world something a dead hero simply cannot. A living hand is worth more than a marble monument. I have thought hard about that, and I believe it is true as far as it goes. But here is where it stops. It only holds if the long life is actually lived, if the man is genuinely present, genuinely risking something, genuinely building. The Jarl himself admitted that tonight. A long life without that is not the counter-argument to a glorious death.
Here is the strongest thing the captain could say, and I will not soften it. A man is not a field. He is not measured by what he produces or how long he lasts. He is measured by the pitch of his commitment, by what he was willing to stake, and by whether he ever, even once, put everything he had against something that mattered enough to die for. There is a kind of life that looks full from the outside and is hollow at the center, because the man who lived it never once risked total loss. He preserved himself carefully, right down to the end, and in doing so he preserved nothing worth keeping. The glorious death is not a waste. It is the proof. It is what you get when a man has held nothing back. And that kind of wholeness, that complete spending of a self on something larger, is the highest thing a human life can reach. I have said that as honestly as I can, because it deserves to be said honestly. And now I will tell you why I still stand where I stand. The captain's argument proves that full commitment is the measure of a life. I agree, but it does not prove that dying is the only way to demonstrate it. My father committed fully for decades to people who were standing right.
Both men just argued the other side so well I briefly forgot which side they were on. That is either a sign of great minds or a very confusing evening, and I am not sure it matters which. Closing arguments are next, and that is where one of these cases has to win. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, I'm Justice Vale, and this is the standing resolution. We've watched both men argue their own side, take fire from the other, and then, in a move that takes real nerve, argue the case they've been fighting all night. Now it comes down to the close. Let's hear the final arguments.
Here is what this whole night comes down to. Both of us agreed that the measure of a life is commitment. Both of us agreed that a long life can be a shipwreck, and that a glorious death is proof of total giving. The Jarl built his whole closing argument on the idea that full commitment, repeated every morning, is what matters most, and I said amen to that because it is true. But here is the thing he cannot escape. We are not debating the best possible long life against the worst possible death. We are debating what is better as a standard, as a North Star to sail by. And the glorious death sets that standard clearly. It says this is what full commitment looks like when it is absolute and undeniable. It gives you something to measure everything else against. The long, quiet life, even at its finest, borrows its meaning from that standard. The Jarl's father was great because he had stood in the line. Take that away and you have a different man and a different story. He even told us so himself. Every man who signs the articles knows he may not come home. That knowledge is not a curse. It is what makes every day aboard worth something. The grave takes everyone, but only some of us.
The captain says the glorious death sets the standard, that everything else borrows meaning from it. But listen to what he has just told you. He has told you that the measure of a life is something other than the life itself. That the years of building, teaching, enduring, loving, failing, and rising again, all of that is only valuable as a footnote to a single final moment. I do not accept that, and I do not think in their bones most men do either. My father stood in the shield wall, And then he came home, and he did the harder thing. He stayed. He was present when it cost him something to be present. He gave counsel when silence would have been easier. He handed what he knew to hands that would carry it further than he ever could. That is not borrowing meaning from a glorious death. That is generating meaning, day by day, until there is enough of it to outlast you. The captain asks whether you ever truly sailed. I ask whether the sailing was ever in service of something larger than the sailing itself. A death proves what you are willing to lose. A life proves what you are willing to build. And when the fire goes out, it is what stands in the cold that matters, not how bright.
Well, I have moderated a great many arguments on this stage, and I can tell you that very few of them end with both sides having genuinely moved the ground beneath their own feet. Tonight was one of those nights. Captain Roon gave us fire and consequence, and the idea that a death of total commitment sets the standard by which everything else is measured. Jarl Havard gave us endurance, presence, and the quieter argument that building something lasting is not a lesser act, it is the longer one. Both men argued the other's case with real honesty, and both came back to their own positions stronger for having done it. Who won? That is not my call. It never is on this show. That is yours. We ask only one thing of you before you go. Head over to Paxelle.tv and vote on the resolution you want to see debated next. The audience picks the question. We find the argument. That is the deal. One thing before we close, and I want to say it plainly. The standing resolution features AI personas built for the purpose of debate and entertainment. The positions you heard tonight were assigned by draw, not held by conviction. What was real was the reasoning. What you do with it is entirely up to you.